In Windsor Forest, there's said to be a rider who appears at night. Antlers on his head, hunting horn in hand, and something that's following behind him through the trees. Some say he's a ghost of a royal huntsman. Others claim he's something far older, the last trace of a forgotten god. But when you trace him back to the earliest evidence, the story becomes much stranger. Because this isn't just a question of who this rider was, it's a question of whether he really existed. Welcome to the mysteries of mythology. Herne the Hunter. Welcome back, mystics. There are a few different versions of Herne's story, but the one I want to start with is the fullest and most famous, the version shaped by William Harrison Ainsworth in the novel Windsor Castle. In that version, we're taken back to the reign of King Richard II. Windsor Forest is the king's hunting ground, close to the castle, filled with deer, keepers, and huntsmen who served the crown. Among them was Herne. He was said to be the finest woodsman in the forest, the best tracker, the boldest rider, the man who knew the chase better than anyone else. Richard trusted him, favoured him, and kept him close during the hunt. The other keepers noticed. They saw how often the king turned to Herne first. They saw how much honour he received, and over time their jealousy grew. Then came the hunt that changed everything. One day, the king and his company rode out after a great stag. The animal broke through the woodland at speed, and the hunting party scattered as they followed it. Herne rode close behind the king, with the hounds calling somewhere ahead and the forest rushing past them. Then the stag disappeared into thicker ground. Herne stopped, climbed down, and searched the earth. Where others saw mud and broken branches, he saw a trail. A snapped twig, fresh marks in the soil, a path through the undergrowth. Within moments he had found the stag again. He mounted his horse and rode on, with the king following close behind. Soon they had left the rest of the hunt far behind them. At last they found the animal. It had been driven hard, and when it could run no further, it turned. The king raised his bow, but before he could loose the arrow, the stag charged. Herne had only a moment to act. He threw himself between the king and the animal, taking the full force of the antlers into his body. Man and stag fell together. Herne was badly wounded, but even as the animal tore into him, he managed to draw his knife and drive it into the stag's neck. The beast fell dead. Herne lay beside it, barely alive. The king called for help, but the others were too far away. Then, from among the trees, an old man appeared. He was wrapped in a cloak of leaves, with weathered face and strange bright eyes. He looked down at Herne and said the huntsman might still live. But if he was to be saved, the king must not question what was done. Richard agreed. Herne had saved his life and no ordinary help was coming. So the old man began his work. He lit a fire of oak wood. He spoke words the king did not understand. Then he cut the antlers from the dead stag and fastened them to Herne's head. For a moment, Herne no longer looked fully like a man. He looked like something caught between the huntsman and a beast. As the old man worked, the rest of the hunting party finally reached the clearing and stood watching in silence. When it was finished, Herne opened his eyes. Slowly, against all reason, he rose. He was weak, pale, and marked by terrible pain. But he was alive. The king saw it as a miracle, and Herne was brought back from the forest with great care. In time, he recovered. And because Herne had served him, Richard raised him higher than before. He made him chief among the keepers of Windsor. But that only made the hatred around him worse. In one darker version of the story, the jealous keepers went in secret to the same old man who had saved Herne's life, and they lied. They told him Herne had boasted that no magic had saved him. They claimed Herne said he had survived by his own strength alone. The old man believed them. In anger, he turned against the huntsman he had once preserved and took away the gifts that had made Herne great. From that time on, Herne was changed. The forest no longer seemed to know him. Trails slipped from him. His eyes grew uncertain. His hands lost its old sureness. Deer he would once have found with ease now escaped him. The king's hunt grew poorer, and Herne, who had once seemed born for the forest, moved through it like a man lost in his own life. At first the king was patient, but that kind of patience rarely lasts. After enough failed hunts and enough disappointment, Herne was pushed aside. Then he was dismissed. For a man who had known no life outside the hunt, it destroyed him. He had lived for the forest, for the chase, for the skill of the horse, hound and horn. Without that place, he was left ashamed and ruined, with no clear path ahead. So after days of misery, Herne returned to Windsor Forest alone. There he came to the great oak, and from that tree he hanged himself. But even death did not end the story. When the keepers heard what had happened, shame came over them. They rode out to bring his body down. But as they entered the forest, a storm broke above the trees. Rain lashed down, thunder rolled overhead, lightning tore across the canopy. And when they reached the oak, Herne's body was gone. By the next day, the king had heard everything and was filled with grief. But stranger things were still to come. Not long after, as Richard rode out, he saw a ghostly company of huntsmen moving before him. Black hounds ran beside them, and at their head rode Herne himself. He wore antlers upon his head. His face was pale and dreadful. His old wounds showed fresh again, and whatever stood before the king was no living man. It was something risen from shame, grief, and the dark of the forest. In some tellings, Herne revealed the treachery that had destroyed him. In others, he appeared only as an omen. But from then on, people said he still rode through Windsor Forest at night, especially in winter, passing beneath the branches with horn, hounds, and a company not entirely of this world. Some called him the restless ghost. Some said meeting him after dark was a sign of doom. And the great tree where he died was remembered long after as Herne's oak. So the king's finest huntsman passed from life to legend. That is the fuller story people came to tell about Herne, but it's not where the evidence begins. If you go looking for the earliest clear trace of Herne the Hunter, you won't find it in the full legend. You'll find it in the pages of the greatest playwright who ever lived, Shakespeare. In The Merry Wives of Windsor, written around 1597, Herne appears only briefly. The play is a comedy about Sir John Falstaff, who tries to seduce two married women, Mistress Ford and Mistress Page, partly because he thinks he can get money from them. They realise what he's doing, so they decide to humiliate him. More than once. Herne comes into the story during the final trick. Falstaff is told to come to Herne's oak at midnight, dressed as Herne the Hunter, wearing antlers on his head. Falstaff agrees because he thinks he's going to get nookie à toi. He's not. Herne is not really the focus of the play. He is the costume for the prank. There is an old tale goes that Herne the Hunter, sometime a keeper here in Windsor Forest, doth all the winter time at still midnight walk around about an oak with great ragged horns. And there he blasts the tree and takes the cattle, and make milchkine yield blood and shakes a chain, in a most hideous and dreadful manner. You have heard of such a spirit, and well you know, the superstitious idle-headed eld received and did deliver to our age, the tale of Herne the Hunter for a truth. In some early versions of the text, his name even appears as Horn. That becomes important later, but we'll get back to that. Shakespeare does call it an old tale, handed down by the superstitious, which suggests he wasn't entirely inventing it. Writers at the time, especially Old Willie, often drew on local folklore, especially when setting a story in a real place like Windsor. But this is where historians and folklorists start to disagree. Outside of Shakespeare, there's no convincing evidence of Herne before this point at all. Some scholars think Shakespeare was using a genuine local legend. That might be true. Folklore often exists in speech long before anyone writes it down. But others argue that Herne may have been something else. A useful local spirit, shaped for the play and later treated as if it had always been part of old folklore of Windsor. And some scholars are more cautious still. Folklorist Jacqueline Simpson pointed out that there's no strong evidence for Herne as a fully formed legend before Shakespeare mentions him. Historian Ronald Hutton makes a similar argument, suggesting that Herne may have begun as a literary figure, only later being treated as folklore. It doesn't prove Shakespeare invented Herne outright, but it does mean this is where Herne first becomes visible, or at least documented. At this stage, the story of Herne is still very simple. The wounded huntsman, the curse, the stag, the betrayal, the wild hunt, and the possible pagan god all come later. And once Herne starts to grow, he grows quickly. After Shakespeare, Herne doesn't stay a small part for long. At first, writers try to explain him, then they start adding to him, and before long they're shaping him into something much bigger. Once his name is tied to Windsor, people start asking the obvious questions. Who was Herne, and where did he come from? In the late 18th century, Samuel Ireland suggests that Herne may have been based on a real man, a keeper in Windsor Forest named Horn, who fell into disgrace and took his own life. Not long after, Shakespeare scholar James Halliwell Phillips supported a similar idea. He pointed to the possibility of a real Richard Horn, connected with poaching in Windsor Forest. So even here, people were trying to pull Herne out of folklore and pin him to a real person. Another version gives the story a darker edge. In this telling, Herne kills a white stag connected to a sacred place. For that, he's condemned to hunting forever, wearing its antlers on his head. So far, the story is still fairly simple. But in the 19th century, Herne starts to change much more dramatically. Writers start expanding Herne into a fuller and more tragic figure. One of the most influential versions comes from William Harrison Ainsworth, whose novel Windsor Castle turns Herne into a much larger and darker figure. In Ainsworth's version, Herne isn't just a strange spirit mentioned in a prank. He becomes a spectral force hunting Windsor Forest. This is where many of the details people now associate with Herne really begin to gather around him. The wounding, the antlers, the fall from favour, and the return after death. In some versions, the power that saves him also changes him, and the whole tale takes on a darker tone, with hints of a bargain or curse. I'll put a link to the book in the description. Later still, Herne gets pulled into a much wider tradition, the wild hunt. Instead of remaining a ghost tied to a single oak, he becomes a rider moving through the night, sometimes with hounds, sometimes with a whole spectral company behind him. That idea already existed across Europe. In many wild hunt traditions, the sight of riders was not just frightening, it was dangerous. Those who saw the hunt could be marked for death, carried away into the other world, or even forced to join the riders forever. If you want to know more about the wild hunt, then watch this video next. In Germanic tradition, the hunt is often led by Woden or Odin. Elsewhere, figures such as King Arthur take that role, and one of the closest parallels is King Hrolla, a mysterious ruler from medieval writing who leads an otherworldly host. So the Herne most people know today isn't one ancient figure preserved unchanged through time. By the time all those layers are added together, Herne starts to look much older than the evidence actually allows. But was he really something older? The biggest question around Herne is whether Shakespeare was drawing from something older, and if he was, how much older? That question comes up because figures like Herne already existed across Europe. Stories speak of riders moving through the night, leaders of the dead, and strange figures tied to forests, storms, and the hunt. One of the first comparisons people reach for is Cernunnos. Cernunnos is one of the best known horned figures in Celtic imagery, usually shown with stag antlers and surrounded by animals. So on the surface the comparison makes sense. Herne has antlers, Cernunnos has antlers. Case closed. But not quite. Because the closer you look, the weaker the connection becomes. Cernunnos isn't really described as a hunter. He isn't a ghostly figure, and he isn't linked with haunting, punishment, or a spectral ride through the night. That doesn't make the comparison useless though, but it does make it less convincing. A stronger comparison comes from somewhere else, Woden or Odin. In early Germanic tradition, Woden is tied to the wild hunt. He is a rider at night, moving with a host behind him, connected to storms, battle, death, and the otherworld. There are also a few smaller details people point to. In the later version of Herne's story, he's found hanging from an oak tree. That's often compared with Odin hanging from Yggdrasil, the world tree. It doesn't prove anything, but you can see why people make the link. But Britain didn't need to borrow these ideas from somewhere else. They already had them. Stories about riders in the night, hunts that cross between worlds, and figures tied to death and the other world were already here. Gwyn ap Neath, for example, is one of those figures, linked to the dead, the hunt and the otherworld. And this is where people start talking about folk memory. The idea is that old beliefs don't just disappear. The names change, the meanings shift, but some images stay around. But historians tend to be more careful, and for good reason. There's no solid evidence that Herne was ever worshipped as a pagan god, and there's no clear proof that he was simply Cernunnos, Odin, Woden, or Gwyn ap Neath under another name. But that doesn't mean the image around Herne came from nowhere. The horns, the forest, the night ride, the dead, the hunt are all much older than the first written mention of Herne himself. So Herne may not have been an ancient god in a simple sense, but he does seem to be built from much older materials. So, was Herne a hunter, a ghost, a forgotten god, or something invented? The honest answer is that he's probably not just one thing. As a ghost, Herne makes sense. The legend gives us the wronged huntsman betrayed by jealous men, driven to death and seen again in the forest after dark. As a forgotten god, the evidence is much weaker. There are older figures that resemble him in certain ways, especially when you bring in the wild hunt, Woden, Gwyn ap Neath, and Cernunnos. But resemblance isn't proof. Shakespeare may have shaped him and later writers certainly expanded him, but that doesn't prove he made the whole thing up from nothing. What we get instead is a figure that changes over time. What may have begun as a local spirit, a half-remembered tale, or a useful piece of theatre became something larger shaped by folklore, literature, local memory, and a later interpretation. That doesn't weaken the legend, if anything, it explains why Herne has lasted. Herne lasts because he speaks to something older and harder to pin down than any one version of the story. The fear of the forest at night, and the sense that some places are never fully tamed. So was Herne a ghost, god, or invention? If you think Herne might be connected to something older, then you might want to watch this video next.